Listen, welcome everybody. Hello, hello. I hope you're having a wonderful reunion weekend. It's just couldn't be a better day for it. And it's great to see so many folks here. My name is Ethan Rutherford. I teach in the English department, creative writing. And so it's particularly wonderful to welcome two writers back to campus to read from their work, Charity Elder and Joanna Scott. So we're going to get going quickly. I'm going to sort of introduce Charity first. She'll read, and then I'll introduce Joanna, and Joanna will read, and then we'll have a conversation about writing and life and what it was like to sort of be here at Trinity while they were here with Millis, and it's so great to see you. And then we're going to open things up for Q&A. Their books are here. I have their books. You can't have 5 copies of their books, but their books are available for sale, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to sign their books after the event. So, without further ado, Charity C. Elder is an award-winning journalist and media executive with 20+ years working in reading and broadcast in digital newsrooms, as well as an adjunct at Fordham University's Communication and Media Studies department. In 2017, she was selected and profiled for NYC Media's Vanguard Women in Media. And in 2016, she was named one of the top women in media by Folio magazine. In 2020, she served as a senior advisor to the Mike Bloomberg presidential campaign, advising and strategizing on ways to engage the Black community. Prior to joining the Bloomberg campaign, Elder was the head of video and podcasts for Yahoo News, leading an award-winning team of innovative producers, redefining news in the era of immersive journalism. She also worked for more than a decade as a television and news producer at Emmy award-winning morning shows at both CBS News and NBC News. Elder holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Trinity College. Year 2000, right? And a Master of Arts in Mass Communication and Journalism from New York University, and currently serves on the Board of Fellows for Trinity College and on the Jeremiah Program's National Governing Board of Directors, a nonprofit that aims to break the cycle of poverty for single mothers and their children 2 generations at a time. Please help me welcome Charity Elder.
Thank you, Ethan. Just as a little setup to the portion that I'm going to read, this is from the last chapter of my book, Power, the Rise of Black Women in America. And I'm essentially synthesizing the main ideas spoken about in the book. I am free, and freeing other Black women is on my agenda. It is why I wrote this book. My freedom is not physical, but it breaks very real chains by reframing narrative and perspective. It is reminding Black women of our innate dopeness. It is the Black woman's inner knowing of Black women, an idea I wrote about in chapter 1. It is that knowing that enables Black women to reject stereotypes and myths proliferated in the media, the academy, and in hearts and minds. In many ways, Black women already embrace our dopeness. That's why we say things like Black girl magic or Black girls rock. While these affirmations are based on an inner knowing and inner truth we have about ourselves, they don't go deep enough to get at the truth of how we do the do. It is why those affirmations ring a little hollow, almost as if we're trying to convince ourselves. I got free because my inner knowing of Black woman is not based on catchphrases, but rooted in data that confirms what I know to be true about Black women. We are dope. So what does dopeness look like in data? The data from the Bicentennial Census and the American Community Survey explored throughout the book analyzed Black women as a group. It was important to understand how we are doing compared to ourselves over an extended period. The analysis of the data shows that in the last 80 years, Black women ages 25 to 64 have seen high rates of growth and median real wages. In the completion of 4 or more years of college and employment in professional and managerial occupations. But the data revealed a few surprises. When Black women as a group were compared to Black men, and white women ages 25 to 64 over the same 80-year span, Black women had the largest percentage of growth in nearly all of the aforementioned variables. The story told by the data is completely different than the stories usually told about Black women. This is the result of 2 things. First, white men and white women are centered as the rubric and gold standard by which all groups are measured. Second, data analysis usually does not compare group performance over a long time span using the variables mentioned and examined in this book. I will explain it another way. In traditional studies on income, occupation, and education, white men are always ahead of Black women. White women too, actually. But by directly comparing Black women as a group and white men as a group for nearly a century, the story we tell ourselves about Black women and white men are suddenly unrecognizable. In the first chapter, I use a popular Aesop fable to illustrate how Black women have been oppressed by white supremacy and patriarchy for centuries. I explained that Black women were typified by the slow-moving tortoise who won the race in an upset. And society was epitomized by the hare, considered the fastest forest creature due to ignorance and timidity, then suffered a humbling defeat. But this time, let's substitute white men for the hare in the fable and compare results. When Black women and white men are compared side by side, the census data showed that the rate of growth for Black women far exceeds the rate of growth for white men in all of the variables examined. When considering real median wages adjusted for inflation, the rate of growth for white men and Black women aged 25 to 64 from 1940 to 2019, that 80-year period, was 300% and 1,000% respectively. When looking at the completion of 4 years or more of college with the same age group over the same period, white men's rate of growth increased 500%, while the rate of growth for Black women completing 4 years or more of college was 1,900%. And finally, when evaluating the rate of growth in employment and professional managerial roles using the same group, the same time span, white men's rate of growth was 300%, while Black women's rate of growth in professional managerial roles was 700%. The truth is that today, Black women earn just 64 cents to every dollar a white man earns. But the data I presented shows the gap is closing. Just as the tortoise was confident in his ability to win the race, I am confident that Black women can win too. It is only a matter of time. The data presented in this book reframes the narrative of Black women. It shifts the framing of the problems we need to solve. The question isn't why hasn't there been more progress? It should be, how can we amplify and support the successful work Black women have been doing for decades? How can we accelerate the rise that's already happening and close gaps more quickly? I posit that a framing that celebrates and centers Black women's agency and success would be transformational. The idea isn't to pretend there isn't much to do. but approach the work from a position of strength. My freedom is predicated on leaning into what I know to be true about Black women. What I've learned from the data and the fact that most Black women say that they have been successful in life. That's according to a study that I did with Mayor's Poll, where we poll Black women across the country. I actually don't care if society gets Black women or not. And it's time for all Black women to decide if it matters if society or white people or any other group sees us. It is my view that Black women are at a point in this country that our ability to create a life of our choosing is possible. Is it easy? No. Is it fair? No. Is it possible? Yes.
Okay, Joanna Scott. Joanna Scott is the author of 13 works of fiction. Her awards include a MacArthur Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Her novel, The Mannequin, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and her stories have been selected for the Pushcart Prize anthologies and Best American Short Stories as well. Her most recent book is a collection of short fiction, Excuse Me While I Disappear, published by Little Brown. A book of interviews, Conversations with Joanna Scott, has recently been published by the University of Mississippi Press, which I guess if you missed today, you could just go get that book. She received her BA from Trinity College in 1982 and teaches at the University of Rochester, where she is the Roswell Smith Burroughs Professor of English and directs the literary arts programs. Please help me welcome Joanna Scott.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back here, and what a powerful reading that was. Thank you for sharing that with us. And one of the things that struck me is you take the data and you tell a story with it, and it makes me think about the power of a story, that we organize information in such a way. I write fiction, so I tell stories that aren't true. But in this collection, what I've tried to get at is the difficulty of telling stories. This is a collection of stories that are about untold stories. In fact, I wanted to call it Unreadable. That was my working title, but my editor wouldn't let me keep that title. For every review that called this book Unreadable, I'd say exactly, that's what it is. But they wouldn't let me do that. So anyway, we'll talk more about Trinity, I think, in our Q&A, but it's so wonderful to be back. In fact, I took a psychology class in this room, I remember. I arrived as a freshman, my very first semester, took a freshman seminar with the poet Hugh Ogden, who, he would sit there and say nothing. There are people nodding. You know this. He would sit there and we someone speak. I mean, imagine if I just stopped reading. It makes us nervous. But I learned that as a technique about teaching. Then Hugh directed me to take a course the following semester as a freshman, this advanced course with the writer Steve Minot, who had written a very important book about fiction. And boy, that was scary to be in the classroom. I was with seniors too. They were all seniors, and I was so terrified. And then in my junior year, I had the opportunity to go to Rome with Milla Riggio, who in 100 different ways transformed my life. So thank you, Milla, who is in the audience today. I will read one of the things I was trying in this collection was to work with different sizes of stories, short stories, long stories. So for today, I'll just read, it's a 5-page story one of the, in a way, the trifles of the book, and just to give you a kind of taste of it. So this is called No One is Available. My friend Alexander, a retired physics professor, could be found on any given day wandering among the stacks of the library, selecting books at random. He read law journals, outdated computer coding guides, chapbooks of poetry from the 1800s, forgotten novels, memoirs of kings and explorers and prostitutes, books about subjects as varied as Byzantine mosaics, Victorian prisons, clock repair, and Scottish epitaphs. His favorite place to while away the seasons was a library basement tucked in at a wooden carrel thickly carved with obscenities and pronouncements of love. During his prime years as a scientist, he concentrated his research on the aerodynamics of raindrops, though he never did more than confirm results from other physicists' experiments. He had a lover who died of cancer in 1985, and he has been single ever since. For pets, he hosted generations of goldfish. He used to play tennis regularly, but in his emeritus years, he was content just to sit and read all day. When we met for a daily pint, he held forth on what he had read most recently, describing content in fascinating detail without ever seeming boorish. I suppose it makes sense that a man who was such a passionate reader would one day decide to write a book himself. But though I pressed him on it, he refused to tell me what his book was going to be about, even whether it was to be based on fantasy or fact. Perhaps he intended to write a novel in verse, I joked, receiving in reply no more than a shrug. Was there one particular work that had lit the fuse of his ambition? He wouldn't say. I pointed out that all of his writing up to that point had been done for scientific journals and in collaboration with his fellow researchers. He'd never written anything on his own. It didn't matter. Once he'd made up his mind, he was fully dedicated to the notion. He gave up the library carrel and set up his office in his house. He purchased an antique pedestal desk with stacked drawers, sharpened the points on a dozen number 2 pencils, fixed corner tabs on his desk to frame a composition book, and opened to the first page. He knew what he wanted to write, but he had no idea how to begin. Now, with everything in place, my friend waited for the words to come to him. He waited patiently through the whole day. He waited in the same fashion the next day. Days turned to weeks, and he was still waiting. 3 months later, he woke early before his alarm clock went off. It was an overcast morning, and the grayness muted the brightening dawn. Alexander knew immediately what he would write. Indeed, he saw his book in his mind, word for word, as if the whole of it were contained on a chalkboard in front of him, like a mathematical solution. He could hardly wait to get going, though he also knew the importance of patience. With methodical care, he made himself rich dark coffee using Japanese paper in a porcelain filter. He ate a buttered English muffin with penny slices of banana on the side. He brushed his teeth, exchanged his bathrobe for jeans and a t-shirt, and went up to his office. He turned on the overhead light and situated his chair appropriately. A bamboo shade covered the upper half of the room's single window. It might or might not be significant that the dictionary on the left side of his desk happened to be open to the page ending with the word charismata, and a magnifying glass placed at an angle over the page captured half of the long definition of the word charge. He rolled a pencil fondly between his thumb and forefinger. He touched the tip to the paper. He wrote, as she looked up at the arms of the masthead, and then the phone rang. The sound, like boiling water, dumped on his head. The tip of the pencil broke. The phone kept ringing and ringing. Alexander picked up the receiver. A misfiring robotic voice announced, "No one is available to take your call at the moment." An attempt, it appeared, to field an inquiry that had never been initiated. "No one is available to take your call at the moment. No one is available to take your call," the robot taunted until Alexander. He was normally an upbeat fellow and wasn't used to feeling so annoyed. He tried to resume where he'd left off, but now he could hear children cannonballing into his neighbor's pool, along with the whirring and beeping of a truck collecting refuse on the street. No matter how hard he tried through the hours and days that followed, he couldn't recover a single word. The book he had barely started was lost forever. Have you ever been interrupted in your work? Do you know what it feels like when your concentration is shattered by unwanted interference and the thread of a promising idea is snapped? Has a person like the person from Portlock ever knocked on your door, as he reputedly did at Coleridge's cottage and Nether Stowey? Perhaps it's been speculated to deliver laudanum, or maybe to collect on a debt. Have you never, like my friend or Coleridge, dreamed of something more perfect than anything you could have come up with when you were awake? Can we even claim that Coleridge's intended poem truly exists in its incomplete state? Isn't it more accurate to say that the poem resulting from the interruption is a wholly different poem from the one Coleridge would have written if he'd been left alone, and then the unwritten Kubla Khan sits beside the printed version like a long evening shadow? When Alexander told me about his attempt to write a book, he would assume responsibility not just for failing, but presuming he could be a writer in the first place. It was stupid of him ever to think he could master language sufficiently to fill a whole book. As for the story of his life, he could sum it up in a paragraph. His brain was too packed with equations to allow much room for his personal memories. He was a numbers guy, and while he admired the ingenuity of writing, verbal manipulation was never his thing. It had always bugged him that dictionaries are so fat, there are so many different words with interchangeable meanings, and anyway, readers are understandably impatient. No one lingers over every painstakingly thought up sentence. In truth, he hadn't wanted to waste even a fraction of his life on something that probably would have resulted in public embarrassment. And when the phone rang, he was already looking for a reason to turn back before he was too far gone. All in all, he said he was grateful for the interruption. From then on, he would stick to science. Give me dry friction, he shouted on the one occasion he got visibly drunk. Give me centripetal acceleration. Give me gravity and torque and incontrovertible data. We clinked pipes, laughing together at his foolishness. I have to admit, though, that even as I was sucking foam from my beer, I was wondering if maybe my friend underestimated himself. I would have liked to read what he came up with. I wonder what he would have revealed if he had gone on to write a book. I know this man. I have experience of his brilliance, his supple, open-minded approach to problems, his vivacity, his sensitivity. I keep trying to guess what he would have written. Would he have offered a new way of thinking about familiar experience? Could it be that his research on raindrops would have given him a unique insight into life? I guess we'll never know. Thank you.
That was wonderful, you guys, both of you. It was really lovely. Enjoying this, you were saying, like, you could just feel the power of just this idea of storytelling in both of those pieces, right? Coming out of your point. And as I was thinking about what sort of bonding you guys sort of together, there is clearly a belief in the power of storytelling, and the importance of storytelling. And I think we're also supposed to go a little bit into the Wayback Machine. When you think about Trinity, because you guys also have that in common as well, in addition to being sort of wonderful authors. And so I think just to open things up, I was curious if, I mean, in that piece you just read, there was talking, what it was looking for, something that lit the fuse of this ambition. And I was wondering if you could just sort of pull yourselves back to your time at Trinity when you were here as students. And I was just curious if you can see sort of the shape that your life has become, if you can see it sort of even then, were there classes that sort of lit your imagination up or help you fall in love with storytelling or see how important storytelling can be in the world?
Yes. That's the short answer. The longer answer is that I was a sociology major. And I've spoken about this before, but I had a professor here, Stephen Voloki, and he actually just retired this year. But there was a concept I learned my senior year called sociological imagination. And it is probably the one and only thing I really remember in all of my lessons from college.
All 4 years.
Yeah, it is the one thing that actually matters in my day-to-day. Then, in terms of capturing my imagination, I noticed it, I remembered it, and it also impacts the book that I wrote. And the idea of sociological imagination is that your life and what your life is and what it represents is not solely because of the choices you made or your family or where you grew up. That's part of it, but you're part of a larger story. And so systems, governments, bureaucracies, all impact the choices you have, the choices you make, and how you decide to live your life. And that is why you can look back in history. And I believe that we will look back at this time for Black women and consider it its own renaissance in terms of what's happening today. That we will look back and say there was a culmination of things that happened. And so that idea of sociological imagination, first of all, let me realize that I was part of a larger society, a larger group of people, also global. How I thought of myself also came from the fact that I was born in the United States. But all of those things really is what sparked my imagination. And as a journalist, that was a guiding principle for me in terms of not just stories that weren't told, but stories that told different stories, and stories that had different arcs, and stories that maybe were messier than stories that television typically likes to put on, right? And so less of the entertainment and more of the informing of how we are all interconnected. And I'll just say very quickly, to the Trinity Rome campus. I loved it. So yeah.
Have you sent your book to that professor? And
oh, are you kidding? Well, when I was thinking of the idea, I looked at his email address and I was like, dear God, please let him still be at Trinity. I emailed him, was like, I don't know if you remember me. And he's like, he emailed back right away. Of course, I remember you. And so the way that I shaped the U.S. Census data in terms of looking at it was based on a conversation I had with him talking about the book and how it would shape the book. So yes, he's also an acknowledgement. So he's more than, read the book and had a signed copy.
It's wonderful. Your ability to look at experience, at history, at culture, and find a different way of thinking about it. It's extremely powerful because at the root of it is intense optimism, but it's fierce and it is tireless. I get the sense of an intense energy that's required to keep telling that story, but at the root of it is such as you used the word celebration earlier in reading, so that's very powerful. I would say for me, when I first arrived, I went straight into this freshman seminar in creative writing. I had thought I would go into medicine. That was my plan because I know Milla's laughing. What's you laughing, Milla? I had thought that I would go into medicine because I've been working on an ambulance and at a hospital for many. After my high school, it was an extremely formative experience. But then I took a chemistry course. Maybe that's why you're laughing. But I took this freshman seminar in creative writing, and I've been writing from the time I could pick up a pen. I writing sort of privately, and in high school started to be a little bit more public with my efforts. But it wasn't until I got to that freshman seminar that I think I realized how exciting it was to make something that was imperfect. That with him, nothing was ever right, but he cared so much that I could take the work back and then think, okay, then I have to do something else with it, or the next piece, So I think I began with that class to tie in writing with revision, and that was absolutely essential for me. And then I would say the next thing was my program with Mila. We actually did a special concentrated study program with a group of students led by Mila in Rome, studying Shakespeare, studying love poetry, studying adaptations into Italian from English literature. And there, I felt that what you were describing with your course is a sense of how everything was connected. That there I was in Rome, reading Shakespeare, trying to learn Italian, and everything was related. And so it just felt like the smallest thing was impactful. And I started to look at the world in a new way, I think, and over that semester, and see my connection to culture, to history, and recognize myself as a writer is just very small piece of that big picture, and that was really exciting.
No, I mean, yeah.
And I met, as Mila knows, and my daughter's here, my husband, my late husband now, but he was a fellow student on this program. And from day one, we met, we became best friends, and we never met before at Trinity. We're never I don't know, maybe I pulled a beer for him when I worked at the pub. We had a pub back then. But we started to read each other's work, and that also was transformative, because that became part of that Rome experience, that suddenly writing became a collaborative process for me, and that lasted for 4 years.
It's interesting what you're saying about writing in terms of your lifelong pursuit of writing and learning through trial and error the importance of revision while you're writing and writing to revise. For me, as a producer, it was about telling us. It was always about telling a story, which is why I use storytelling as a part of a huge part of my work. But storytelling, using picture, using sound, there's a technical and also an artistry to it, where you don't want the words to compete with what people see or what they hear, that there's other ways to tell the story. And so, in knowing that I needed to write this book, I did put myself on my own, very own, sort of teaching myself as I was going how to write. And so it was in a podcast and various things, but there's one book was seminal and extremely important, and it mentions a lot of the things that you said. So I was able to get a shortcut to the things that you learned over time. And the book is called Several Short Sentences About Writing by Berlin Klickenborg. And he, taught at Yale, taught at Fordham, also worked on the New York Times editorial board, a columnist. And what he writes about is its first premise, and it's germane to what you're saying, and this idea of writing, because I really fell in love with this whole aspect of writing and rewriting. But for him, and this is for your friend, did not continue to push forward, which is every sentence is its own main star. And that a sentence, if you think of it like a play, a stage and a play, it's its own act. It doesn't depend on what comes before it or after it. And this idea that you work on the sentence until the sentence is right. And then also this, in terms of the patience that takes and the fortitude And the work that, I mean, it's hard and it's painful and you feel like you have nothing to say. And so I had a real love-hate relationship with the process. But that idea of, you know, he talks about noticing what you notice. And then writing about that and and you keep writing until you believe that you've written something that someone can understand the thing that you've written. And that's, you know, really what I sought to do in this book. And so some of the words that you're using and the way that you're describing that process is very different than the words coming from some celestial place that just pours over you and, you know,
Just came
I'm
out
gonna
perfect.
write
Yeah.
and this is it, first draft done. And no, it actually is, okay, is that saying what I wanted to say? Did I say it as cleanly as I needed to say? Did I really need all the words to say the thing? Is there a better word? And then also in what you shared with us, your excerpt, also what I loved about it was also that idea of writing, you know, he didn't want to look at all the words in the dictionary. Now, thankfully, we have the internet, and I have a subscription to Merriam-Webster, unabridged version. But the thing is, it's like, you know words, right? And then I said, well, I know what that word is. Something easy like, I don't even have the example, but you have a word, put it in, and you go, well, actually, I meant a word related to that word. That actually isn't even what I meant to say. It isn't quite right. Oh, here's an example. Between grief, bereft, sadness, you know, bereft is very different from being sad. And so what do you mean when you're using those words? And so that's what I fell in love with. It was like, I can do this.
Oh, wow.
Or, you know, like I want to do, and I want to wrestle with it and just allow myself to not say, you know what, that's an awkward sentence. Grammatically or otherwise, or how it sounds when you read it. That's, and then just keep going, or that's not quite, but like tackle with that thing.
And you make me think of something I want to add in your wonderful description of the process of writing, the care that's needed at the level of the sentence. The very important thing that I received from Trinity, and I think of Mila especially, was that I had this teacher who was thinking with me and feeling about I was telling Mila I still have the notebook that I kept in Rome, which was 100 pages. Mila wrote on every single page. How did she have the time to do that?
Wow.
I don't know. But I was able to absorb the teaching of that, and if nothing else, aspire to give that back to my students as they were and are learning to write. And so that, you know, as you're working to try to figure out, do you use bereft, do you use sad, what do you do? Maybe somewhere in the background is that teacher who it not just was correcting, but who cared, you know, who gave you a sense of this matters. And so I would say that was a very special thing I got from Trinity.
Well, and that's really interesting. I mean, because both of that, like, sat down and done the work in a way that is like really incredible, and it also sounds like, you know, Trinity, you have like this incredible sort of, you had an incredible career in journalism, and then you go, now it's a book, and then you were sort of, like, in the courage to just sort of say it's a book and to teach yourself how to do that. I think it's incredible. And you're also a teacher as well, right? You've taught.
Yes.
Do you have a version? So that is one of those things that you kind of, you're a student, and then when you suddenly have to explain, as you were talking about, to other students, all these sort of weird memories kind of come back, like the Miller's, and not everybody is as wonderful as Miller in terms of giving you that kind of like attention. And I was curious if your experiences as a student, Jody, you spoke about this really wonderfully, but how that has informed your sort of life as a teacher, and just sort of like being, I guess, sort of like how the world is about.
One of the, and I noticed this pretty early on after I left Trinity, and then even after grad school, where I noticed that after Trinity, my ability to think, and to think in multiple dimensions, meaning, so not just outside of the box, but you can solve or think through a problem on multiple levels, right, in various ways. And so, you know, for me, the thing that drives me about writing is about having something to say. Something to say that adds something to the world. And so for me, the idea of the thing, or the reason I'm writing it, comes before the actual words. And so, you know, the why and the what and how you're trying to say it, even if it was, you know, fiction, I think I would still approach it the same way. But what Trinity taught me was critically assessing the world so you can tell these stories, which was extremely important, you know, as a journalist and the information that you put out into the world. And so for me, it was less about some of those technical things, that I did take writing, and I was a teacher's assistant in the English course here at Trinity, and I thought about pursuing writing. I decided to do sociology after talking to her, India Lord Wilma, who's the year ahead of me. Wow. And I also took a biology course because I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I was like, nope, that's not for me. I liked science in high school, but I do not like it on the college level. So I took it once and I was like, yeah, no. And so I needed to declare a major. And India was like, what about sociology? I'd taken a course. She was already a sociology major. You know, so for me, it was less about, I always read a lot. So it was less about the technical, but more about, are you communicating something that needs to be said and that adds value, especially in a time where there is so much information that, like, we're all on overload, your ability to access that information. And so for me, there really has to be a reason that someone wants to read something that I wrote. And that was probably the hardest part of that writing process. It was, I mean, it may sound easy in my relating it now. That's also because I had an idea, then I waited on it for 4 years to make sure it was a good idea. Right. And then combining sociology, and I would say the closest analogy was my senior thesis that I did for sociology, and writing that. And it was supposed to be a year-long thesis, and then I wrote it in the last 2 months. And that was terrible doing that process. But the part that I really enjoyed was the research, and then synthesizing it and pulling it all together into telling a story. And then as a journalist, you always want to tell, how do you tell a story in a good way, right? That's always, how do you hook the audience? And so that's also probably why that training, you know, as a journalist, pulling that all together. And so for me, you know, talking about the power of Black women, I did not want it to just be about myself and my 5 best friends, right? Like, there's power in narrative and in your own story, but it's been done a lot, right, since slave narratives in terms of Black women. And I wanted to find a way to prove it. And that's why I use the U.S. Census data, and also a survey I did with Mayor's Poll, a national survey of Black women. And so the narrative is a part of this. You know, it is informed by narrative and stories of Black women and my own stories. But the foundation and the proof of it is not just because it was lived, but because there is data to show that.
Are you thinking that it will be the book, or are you thinking about moving it into sort of television as well, or? I'm sort of curious because you have such a sort of career in television. Why, like, what is it about the book itself? You know, like, oh, this is the vessel to get that storytelling, that information.
You know, so when I was at Yahoo, I oversaw teams in terms of editorial and the stories we would do and, you know, reading through scripts and all of that, but there also was a business side to my role. And so when you look at, as much as video is great for generating revenue, and advertisers like that, it is the internet is really driven by the written word. And the things that tend to have, you know, more staying power in terms of ideas is when it's written. And so it was also that idea of it. And also because with video, so television, say video now, because there's the internet and there's all these, you know, different mediums and ways to look at it. TV, it's true. But looking at and because you don't just have the story or the written word, you also have what's competing is how can you tell it visually in an interesting way. And I just wanted to contend with the information. And I wanted people to be able to absorb the complexity, which is actually a lot harder to do. I think as successfully with video as you can with the written word. Someone can go back and read something, whereas they watch it, they missed it,
Yeah, no, that's lovely. I'm embarrassed as a question, but what about the television show? So Julie, a couple of questions for you. Like, so Chair, did you write it? I'm wondering if you wrote a thesis when you were here. And then I'm also wondering if you sort of come to your own work in terms of storytelling, like knowing what sort of the story is as you were telling it, or if your process is slightly different from what Charity was talking about in terms of coming to her own stories.
Yeah. I would say the equivalent of the thesis I wrote was probably I did an independent study course with a writer named Alia Sells and wrote a collection of stories for that. So I don't think did we have a formal thesis back then?
Yes.
Oh, we did.
They do one semester or two semesters.
Oh, okay, so I guess
the one.
whoops, yeah. It was actually that. It was that was my thesis.
Nicely encouraged to think that.
But I am aware of the blankness of the page when I'm looking at it, and I will often have an idea that doesn't translate. The page remains blank, which that little story was about. But I absolutely agree that the attention to the independence of the sentence is crucial in learning how to write. I also, as a writer of narrative, depend on the following through, so that even if I have a rickety sentence, it leads me someplace. And what I can do is look back at the sentence and say, okay, there's this in it. And I go forward and I read the next sentence. And then I can look back and say, okay, there's this, you can think of it visually, you know, you have your footprints in the sand. Okay, that's where I'm reading. And I can perhaps get a sense of direction through that. That backward look as the narrative is thrusting me forward. That said, I am probably more than ever now thinking about what we're actually learning when we're in particular reading stories that aren't true. That if there's information, if there's data, if there's a truth that needs to be told, that has its immediate value. So what's the learning value? There's certainly, we say, lots of entertaining value in just being gripped by the uncertainty that comes in a story when you don't know how it's going to end, and you just have to know, so you keep turning pages or keep watching, or just the very quality of suspense that's at the heart of narrative is very important. What are we learning from it? And that's been a question that has been asked more than ever in the last decade, because there's been such pressure on the humanities. Perhaps not about pressure. I wonder if the more we're asked this question, what are we learning? Maybe the more we can learn from it. But I found myself thinking, as you were describing your ability to think critically about the world around you, but partly because of these classes at Trinity, at the root of it is language. You know, it is we to think and then articulate depends upon these words that we're using. So if nothing else through the humanities, we hopefully are learning a facility with words, and that's empowering. That gives us the ability to say no, to say that's not the way I want to tell that story. And so I think even if I don't have an idea when I'm going into a new work, that's behind it. These things, at least, this determination to try to figure out what we can learn by using language to think critically.
Yeah. Let's open it up to questions and after this. So folks, please, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I had a number of questions that had to do with sort of happy accidents that have occurred over the course of your guys' careers that sort of seemed important, like turning points. But I also sort of listening to what you guys have both sort of been saying about sort of the importance of the work that you're doing. I'm actually sort of curious if I'm not entirely sure how to phrase this, but if you could sort of say something about what you hope Trinity is kind of has its eye on as an institution. Now, knowing what the lives that you've sort of led and all that stuff, what is it that you are hoping that sort of in the future, as we're sort of asking these questions, or especially on sort of something that you hope that Trinity does kind of as alums of this institution, really sort of, you were talking about sort of the concept of how important it is to look at certain things. And what is that for you guys?
Well, I mean, I would say in the most practical sense, retaining the small class here, that has those classes were the most formative for me. I think that they force a student to be active and engaged. A student can't just be in the back sitting on a phone. So the more interactive the classes can be, the better for learning. And I think that happens here. That has always happened at Trinity. So there are ways to keep mixing that up. But I would say that is important. As you know, we think about what Trinity is, what it can be. Trinity is always evolving and growing and hopefully empowering new generations of students. But I'll just start there. The small class,
Well, no, I mean,
all of that.
I mean, right, it is that way of saying like, because everything does change and shift. So it's another way of answering is what should sort of stay the same and it's valuable.
Yeah.
Charity, what do you think?
Thought about it. It's great deal, not just Trinity per se, but the humanities as a way of teaching, because technology is as we know a huge force. We think about AI and ChatGPT and all these things coming that we don't quite understand. And what does that mean for various industries, particularly when it comes to writing, teaching, where yes, I believe a student used ChatGPT and confronted him with it in class. Like
You've had that?
I had that actually happen this he didn't, but it was clear to me that I didn't. But so for me, it's the reason why the thinking, the creativity, the process of all that is so important is because there has to be something unique that that humans offer that AI cannot do. And so when it comes to Trinity and the humanities, you know, being able to think for yourself and having a point of view, or in terms of I was a sociology major, so I began to see society very differently. You know, I thought of myself as a not hardcore, but somewhat of like a Marxist or something of that nature, just from learning these things, right? And so there's value in struggling with the way things are and wanting to make them different. And the only way you can do that is to not be a robot, right? As how you approach things, not to be lazy about it. And that ability is, I believe that, you know, that IP, that you know, having your own ideas is going to be essential if AI can take ideas and do something with them, but it doesn't have the lived experience the way that we do. And so how Trinity approaches that, I believe will stand out than say going to a school and your major is accounting. In terms of when you look at what technology can do, and you know, can you interpret that you know, the big data or all of that? How do you, you know, work with is going to be super important in terms of the jobs that will be most valuable. And so that's one area. And the second, I would say, you know, for me, for my individual experience, I graduated in 2000. Trinity was great. I thoroughly enjoyed Trinity. And, you know, I learned how to lead and how to think and all these wonderful things. But for a lot of, you know, Black and brown people, like I am not the usual typical story. And so, and I'm not just pointing out just race, which is essential, but in all the ways that there's difference and diversity. And so Trinity, like a lot of places, can still talk about these things, but then how do you change a person's day to day? Where I participated in a couple of mentorships with Trinity students over the last couple of years that were, you know, remote, like you helped them through a very specific problem. And one Black woman was so disillusioned by Trinity. Her plan was to go to another country in the Caribbean, where her family was from. She wasn't raised there. Another Black woman, you know, she loved her experience, right? So it's just that we have got to more concretely not just be, you know, you think of the changing demographics, now everything is changing. Trinity to be relevant, there has to be intention and success in terms of, you know, diversifying the groups and how and their experiences here, and also in terms of technology and being able to utilize that creativity to always think and do what perhaps AI at least can't do right now.
Yeah. I will add to that then the issue comes up about affordability of Trinity, of course, with every other school, university, college, and university. It's increasingly next thing. I was a full scholarship student, work study, and Trinity let me continue with my scholarships while I went to another school for a year, while I went to Rome, while I took my time off, but it was a very flexible system. And so just trying to figure out what we can do to make college affordable. I imagine you in your classroom, or you know, they said with students who work a lot in order to just get the bills paid. And so just as much as possible, make it easier for this age group, make it affordable. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I see hand, it's a hand. Yes.
Well, there's no mic, so I'll speak loud. This question is actually more for Joanna because you're teaching. My question is, how long have you taught? How many years have you been doing this at University of Rochester?
35.
So have you had anyone publish in that time? Have
Oh,
you had
sure. Yeah.
lots of
Yeah.
them?
No lots.
Yeah. Do you encourage them to self-publish?
They encourage themselves.
So a lot, that's happening a lot.
That's
I know
happening a
I've
lot.
read a lot of
Yeah,
things like
yeah,
that.
and I think the internet gives a bit of an illusion that it is harder than it is, or the students are coming in having already published several books and books, self-published. What I don't like to see, I think that's it. That's just another option. It's not a terrible option. In a way, it just anything that opens up and makes things available, that's good. But there's a little trickiness there that some students will be paying for that to self-publish, to even submit a manuscript to a press that then will self-publish. So it becomes an expensive endeavor to do that. So I don't encourage that at all. But I see that. That's something that I'm nervous about. I'm also, the world's a lot of books, and I myself am saying I better slow down. The world doesn't necessarily need another book by me. So I just would want students to really take time before publishing. There's no hurry usually. So I try to, I guess in terms of teaching, I'm trying to think about skills that are translatable and to many careers. And not every student in a creative writing class is going to become a writer. And I just want to keep that in mind always when I'm writing comments. I try to introduce them to as much literature as I can, just so they have a broad a sense as possible of literary history. And that can be useful for anything in life. So thank you.
So I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation on. I enjoyed the fact that we're able to come back on and have two women present fiction and nonfiction. And as both storytellers, in the sense of how the genres are oftentimes juxtaposed. But Charity, here you are writing nonfiction, and you are countering myths and other kinds of stories that are not true. And for you, Joanna, from other fiction writers that I know, although you may or may not admit or find it's true, but I oftentimes find that in fiction there's a lot of truth and autobiography. Right? But I guess for both of you, given that you have your day jobs, how do you lead a writer's life? And what does that look like?
That's a good question. Wow.
Yeah, I would, when I left my job at Yahoo January of 2020, maybe if I waited a couple of months, I would have made a different calculation. And then I would be sitting here today, I suppose. But I did not. I thought I'd write a book, which I did full time, 3 years. I did publish to a publisher. I agree with you about publishing. But even with all the issues that there are in publishing, I think it's even harder in self-publishing. That's the conversation. But I would say I'm just realizing now that I think I'm going to do a writer's life. So I'm figuring it out as we go. So I'm really curious to hear what you have to Joanna, and I've been teach now at Fordham University, and so that balancing of that versus I always have all these ideas about how eds I could write, and so I'm still figuring it out, right? That writer's life, and I see that it can happen in various ways that combines journalism on some level, continue to write books, but yeah, I love.
Well, I'm curious about Ethan too. Because I'm at a weird stage in life where I have many years behind me and there are reasons to be turning and rethinking. And so it's a very confusing time currently for me. I mean, if I talk about what I did for 35 years, I raised a family, and while the kids were at school, I sat at my desk and I wrote books. That it was so boring. I mean, not boring. It wasn't boring at all. So that I know you guys just writing the last paragraph of a book. Yes, I know exactly what I'm going to write. And I heard for dinner. But I'm so they're because of many changes for professionally with people retiring and personally they're I'm sort of like, where am I now as a writer? Not so sure, but you as a writer in sort of who are you're publishing, you're teaching. What's it? You're raising a family. So what is the day like?
It's very boring. I mean, it's really sort because there's the tension is always sort of with the writing is you kind of have to find these pockets where you can kind of submerge yourself into the work, but with the rest of your life, it's kind of always pulling you back up to the surface, whether that's kids or sort of job or things. And I think the piece of advice that a writing teacher gave to me when I started was wanting to take it seriously was keep your overhead low. So you can actually sort of so you can afford to have those moments you can say no to sort of, right? So you can kind of protect your time. If you keep it sort of cheap, you don't have to earn as much money to then sort of protect your time, which is priceless. I'm sort of like that. And the other thing is to just understand how long it takes. And Joanna, you started talking about that sense of the kids leave and you sit down and you work and you go, that was good. And the work itself has value. It's not necessarily sort of getting too far ahead of the work. And being like, well, this is going to be a novel, and then it's going to sort of turn into this that you sink into the process. You do it because you love it.
Yes, that is so important.
But it took me until sort of not loving it with my kids. Like, please be quiet. Just be like, oh, and that was sort of a shift for me.
Yeah, the loving the process. You have to love to sit at a desk. And I have a very dear friend, writer Maureen Howard, no longer alive, but she was asked a similar question, and what more along the lines of what was it take to write. She said, well, the most important thing, she was a very proper woman, is to affix your ass to the chair. The fun of it for me, I had from my earliest memories of childhood, I just loved to pretend to be someone else. And that pretending, so there's definitely, in all pretending, there's an autobiographical element, absolutely. Probably the most important element, but I just love that imagination, the cultural, with the sociology of imagination. Yeah, that for me as a writer, it's been on the character level. So that makes that desk really interesting, the process really interesting.
Oh my gosh, hands everywhere. Becca, and then we're getting more stressed.
I'll be really quick. Thank you all for having us today. I, last 2013, I just published my first book last night. It took me 10 years to publish, and so I am a rare breed as a female. A person to be able to take time. I hated my book for a long time. I hated it. So even though I know we say that it's boring, but what do you do in the midst of the monotony of like, now that it's here, now you have to put it out there to the world, like, how do you do that?
Oh, that's the hard part, right?
Oh, yeah,
Right,
right,
getting it out into the, getting closer to the middle, that's what you were.
Haven't been to, but I'm like scared of it. I love it, I hated it, but I got it, but now it's here and.
I think the first thing is start the next book. I know, it's
Yeah, well, also when it's out in the world and, and someone can find it at a bookstore, see it on Amazon, then you're also revealing yourself. And it gave me a new respect for people who are entertainers, or they write a lot of books, or because you're constantly, it was very different being a producer for a large organization that put out a lot of content, and that millions of people are seeing what you've done and thought about. It's very different when it's you, your name, your individual idea, and it's just here for everyone to see. And so that's some of it. That's some of it. But I would say, like, the most fun is also in the engaging real people. Maybe they didn't even read what you wrote, but they listened to something you said during the conversation and then took it further. And talking to just real people, and that's something you can set up on your own, whether you have a publisher or not. And actually, a lot of publishers tell you to do the marketing. So that's a way of like engaging people about your work is really, really humbling and satisfying. And I think that's a way to kind of like let it live and have a way of continuing to engage. Oh, yeah.
You had hand up and then.
No, actually, I think you had your hand up for a while.
Are they siblings or are they first cousins?
Well, here we are, nonfiction and fiction, it's expository being, the factual side of things.
Like, oh, right.
Yeah,
A lot of us, they're not both sides. Stories about words, we have good presentations. We bring papers for the scientific journals.
absolutely.
And I read a lot of people, a lot of that writing.
Well, a dear friend who's a lawyer said to our daughter who was about to go to law school, it's in the courtroom, it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Yeah.
In the courtroom, really, but yeah, so it matters, the expository, the shaping of the sentence, the arrangement of language, the persuasiveness of the information.
Being able to follow up the story that I'm here to follow and by it and include.
Yeah, and even an email, right? I see an email, even as that, right? Like, so say you're at your job and you're trying to get X, right? From whomever to either help you along with the project or get more money, whatever it is, you are crafting a narrative, like, and how you structure it, how you started, right? There's too many words. Does it get the point across? Is it interesting? Does it have enough information that someone can take it, do what needs to be done? Part of, you were talking about the writing for fiction, it's that, for me, there's always learning. there's always something that you're picking up, even if you don't realize, you're picking it up. And the short story that you wrote about, for me, I listen to that story, I don't want to be like him, I want to finish with me.
Absolutely.
And so what did he do? He just got up, chair, and he gave up on it, right? So there's a life, actually a life lesson. And then I'll say very quickly, I was, with the Judy Blume book, like the movie that has recently come out about it, there was someone talking on a podcast I was listening to that was essentially saying when they watched the movie, they realized that a lot of what they had picked up as a young girl, right? It wasn't just about their menstrual cycle and all that. It was like, not wearing socks with your sandals, or like little, things that they formed, like you do this, but you don't do that. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. You do these things, and it just picked it up because it was in the book, and like the learning that went along with that,
Yeah.
right? That then applied to their lives. So, in the same way, in terms of writing, I think you do have something to say. I also believe the same thing for fiction. You're saying something, right? You gave a lesson about writing process and an expectation of what it really is, based on the story.
I'm gonna be conscious of time here, so maybe one or two more questions, and then I'm sure that both authors will be happy to sign books or carry the conversation outside, but. So there were a couple more hands. Did your question get answered? Do you wanted?
Not really, it was sort
I
of.
guess I wanna go last.
Every single person kind of, so yeah, thank you. Like, some conversation here and. I can tell my mind. We touched on a little bit about. Writing. How much of yourself is actually in your writing? You can tell.
Well, I'm thinking what you said about how you did not want this to be about your friends, and that's very powerful. So you reach out, you have to do a lot of work, but you reach out, but still, your voice is there, and we hear you in that book. And I suppose as a fiction writer that is always involved in kind of hiding. Where am I in the fiction? When I'm pretending to be someone else, I'm actually all over it. I'm often in it as observer, so looking at the character or looking at myself critically. A lot of emotion that really is transformed into personalities that are so different from mine, that sort of a lot of those core emotions are I recognize them. Perhaps it's the essential autobiographical element is at the emotional level, I'd say. So
Absolutely agree. I did not want to be in the book, mainly because I didn't want it to be discounted in terms of what I was trying to say. That was why. And that it's bigger than my story and basically right. But what's interesting quickly is that India, it's funny that you asked that again, because I took a certain period of time where I was just focused on the book for like 2 weeks, did nothing else. Friend's house up somewhere, and I was just like I was writing like 12 hours a day. It was just pulling everything together and re-looking at some of the chapters, but I was having trouble with the first chapter. I called India, and she gave me like these pointers and things to do. But what was interesting is that part of the reason why I was having trouble that is, it's because it had to begin with my mother.
Like my mother actually started the nonfiction book, like I couldn't write a book about Black women without including my mother in a certain way. I was being too like clinical and sterile. And essentially, the reason why I discovered that the reason why I cared about this so much is because I love my mother. And I love my mother, who taught me to love myself and then value of other Black women. She learned that like there was just no way to disconnect that. And so, and because of the data, I did, I'm sure, I don't know if you know this, but a lot of times you write books out of order in terms of chapter. And so I wrote the chapter last, but I could not do the beginning without starting from the very first person I've ever loved, which is my mother. Right? And like that actually was preventing me. So in terms of like the autobiographical aspect of it, you actually can't even write out of the without contending with some part of yourself, whether it's conscious or subconscious or whatever. So
It's a great final question. It was such
Yeah.
a pleasure to listen to this conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Very good.
There are books right outside. There are. If you'd like to grab a book, and I'm sure the authors will be happy to sign it. Otherwise, on into the reunion night, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, be careful, phantoms, don't get too wild.